What are we considering when we're talking about street photography?
Well, I mean, there are tons of different things. Street photography is an enormous...
Yeah, there's a lot of people who have kind of pigeonholed it into a very narrow thing, but it can be anything you want. You can shoot from fisheye to a 1,000mm lens on there, but I think traditionally most people are talking about a slightly wide-angle lens, maybe 28, 35, 50. That's where most people
traditionally,
see the heart of it. And that's where something like the Fuji X100 has street photography written all over it.
I rubbed it off for the
video. Street photography.
And so I think, definitely being discreet. I think being quiet, and one of the things that we had mentioned earlier is the quiet shutter I'm losing track of all the cameras here.
A few do it, but the
GX7
particularly.
And I'm doing a class on this one. I've been experimenting with the electronic shutter, and it's not just quiet. It is dead silent.
There's no moving parts at all.
Nothing. You do have to shoot it wide open. Otherwise, the aperture will go click, click, which is very, very small. And I think what also can be quite handy is a camera like the GX7, which I'm really liking, which does have a flip-out viewfinder. And so you can be a little bit more discreet. You can put the camera, down by a low railing, or you can shoot it at waist level, shoot from the hip. And so you can be a little less obvious about shooting. Now this one also has a flippy viewfinder, which very few, basically none of them do.
None of them do, no. It's, I mean, that's more useful, I think, probably for video, I would say. It allows you to have a really stable shooting position like that. But
so because of the brightness of...
And for anything like macro photography or really high or low level shooting.
Okay. And do all of these ones that you would recommend for street photography do video?
Pretty much all, although certainly in the case of something like the Fujifilm here, it's not what the camera's good at. And I think there's a tacit understanding on that point from the manufacturer as well. But really, they do. They all offer video now, pretty much, apart from cameras like the Sigma DP series.
But not all video is equal.
No, and in the context of street photography, it's not something I consider really a priority.
Okay. So we talked about being discreet with these little lenses, but what if I do want to be photographing a ceremony that's going on across the way?
Then you're looking at something that has an interchangeable lens that I would want to get up to, say, 200mm on. And you can do that very compactly with the 4/3 system. You can do it pretty compactly with an APS-C system. This is 18 to 140, which is going to give me the equivalent of something over 200. And so this is going to be more than enough. But it is going to force you into a little bit larger system.
So you're further back at this point, you're shooting a longer focal length, you can get further away, so you don't need to worry about silent shutters anymore. You can have larger, noisier cameras and no one's going to bat an eyelid.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're running out of time, so we're going to speed through this. Any other considerations, recommendations for street photography?
I think it's just having that one wide-angle lens. I think this is where working a prime lens, a lot of entry-level photographers kind of don't get the prime lens. I want versatility, but I would say try it. It's going to make you work a little bit, but it's going to make you a better photographer.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't discount wide angles for street photography.
Yes.
You do have to get closer, but as Robert Capa said, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. So.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Then he died. He stepped on a landmine. So there you go.
He got close.
There's a lesson in there somewhere.
All right, we are going to move on to sports and wildlife. There are some quite large cameras going on back here, Barnaby.
So this is what you need, right?
You want to bring up the teleconverter? There we go. Everybody, who's ready?
Not subtle.
No.
Not subtle for shooting. So tell me, do we need these huge lenses to shoot sports and wildlife?
It depends on exactly what you are doing, because we're going to run the gamut of maybe your kids play volleyball, and you can get right up to the edge of the court. You do need a telephoto lens. You don't need a huge telephoto lens. You might need something like that. What are you going to photograph and how far away it is? For most people, it's going to be something in the 200 to 300mm range. This is a 100 to 400mm lens, and 400 is the limit that I've always found for hand holding. You just don't expect to ever get anything longer than a 400 that you can handhold. This type of lens was typically the Africa safari lens. I'm going to Africa, I want to take pictures of animals, I can't mortgage the house or sell a car. What's the biggest thing that I can get that I can handhold and purchase for a reasonable amount of money? Now this is still, I don't know, like around $2,000 or so.
It's not cheap, but in that class, it's relatively affordable.
Right.
This particular lens has actually been around for a long time as well.
And so the larger professional lenses are going to be the ones that let in more light, and they have jumped up in price recently, and they tend to be in the $5,000 to $10,000 range.
Yep.
And they're going to allow faster shutter speeds, shooting at lower ISOs. And it's not what the average person needs.
No. I mean, you'll see, if you hang out at a wildlife reserve for long enough,
Yep.
you'll see a retired doctor who comes up with one of these things. But you don't really need it all the time. I mean, the people
And this
buying
is
them,
the smaller of the much larger ones. This is not that big. This is a 300 2.8. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it goes off into that bird photography.
and they can be in tens of thousands of dollars as well.
Okay.
You know, it's a lot of money.
But
A
if you-
stocking stuffer.
Yeah. Massive stocking.
But if you are going to Africa on safari, if you're going to a game farm and you want to get pictures of animals, you're going to need a 300 millimeter lens as far as the equivalent focal length. Now, the super zooms that we talked about are going to offer that in a very small package. It's not the same image quality, but you know, it's probably good enough for a lot of people's basic photography. When you step up from this, the mirrorless cameras, there's a variety of choices that have lenses that get out there, but I know with Panasonic and Olympus, they do have some models that get up to the equivalent of 600 millimeters in a pretty small package, you know, a lens that's only 4, 5, 6 inches in length.
But I think what we need to talk about as well is actually autofocus, because there are two big priorities, I would say, with sports and wildlife photography. One is telephoto reach, and the other is autofocus. So cameras like this is a very expensive professional level Canon camera. They have fantastic AF
It's
systems.
the EOS 1D.
Yes,
The 1D.
they can track moving objects with a remarkable degree of precision. Now, something like the FZ200, the super zoom there, can't do that. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. I mean, a lot of the time for wildlife, maybe you don't need AF tracking because it's this thing standing in a field far away. Then something like that can do a decent job of it. Anything moving at all, from like weekend kids sports, even kids playing around in a gymnasium, to animals racing at you, you're going to need really good AF, and that is something that you do still have to pay for.
And I think you also need to have a very good understanding of the type of movements that are happening. For instance, if your kid plays second base and all he does is stand there and catch the ball, yes, he's moving around, yes, it's action, but he's not approaching you and he's not moving away from you. So you could use something like this with an appropriate shutter speed. There's actually very few cameras here that could track movement well. I coach a cross-country team, and one of the things I photograph is the kids as they're coming straight towards me in at the finish line. And there is not more than a half dozen cameras here that would do that really well. And that's typically going to be the SLRs because of the type of focusing system we're not going to go into details on, but it's the bigger cameras that can do it. The Canon SL1, which is a single lens reflex camera, is probably the least of the cameras here that could still do it reasonably well.
Yeah.
Now that camera will do it at 3 frames per second. A camera like the 7D will do it at 8 frames per second, which just gives you more opportunities of catching that moment.
And then you move up and they get to 10, 11 frames a second.
And is there that big of a difference? 8 to 10, 8 to 11.
Well, whatever it is, 20%. It's, I mean, one of the reasons why these cameras have very fast frame rates is partly just to mitigate the risk of focus errors. I mean, even in the old days of film, before AF, cameras were running film through at 10 FPS. You get these big adapters. And the reason was you really couldn't guarantee what was going to be in focus, what wasn't. So you get a ton of pictures. You make sure that somewhere in the middle of them is something you can use.
Right, right.
I took out a Panasonic GH3. This is not a GH3. I took a Panasonic GH3 out, which uses an electronic shutter and can shoot up to 20 frames a second. Now this one can shoot up to 40 frames a second. I took it to the state cross-country meet, and I wanted to shoot the runners as they're coming off the line. And typically, if you stand right at the edge, you're going to get 1 or 2 shots. And I got a series of about 15 shots of the runners just slowly taking off of the line, which was something I'd never been able to do because, frankly, I don't have a phantom camera or something that shoots, super high frame rates. And so there are some cameras that can do isolated type action very well.
Yeah, the example you always hear about or you always see is things like the golf swing, capturing a golf swing.
Right.
10 frames a second, you can actually do that.
Okay.
2 or 3 frames a second, it's already happened.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So, and again, can we talk briefly again about, can you get even further zoom with some of these cameras and lenses, extenders, those types of
Yes.
things? Are those quality? Tell me about those.
Well, you're going to definitely want to be into a interchangeable lens camera. And I think this is where the SLRs have a major advantage over the mirrorless cameras. Now, you can use extenders, and they go by extender or teleconverter. This is a 1.4 converter, so it magnifies the telephoto capability by 1.4 times, or we can do 2 times. The downside is this loses 1 stop of light, the 2X loses 2 stops of light, and we're throwing more optics into the mix here, which means image quality goes down. And I've had a lot of people who are kind of like, I got this $300 zoom, can I put an extender on it? I go, you might be able to find one, but it's not going to be very good. My general recommendations are, if your lens does not cost, or is less than $1,000, you shouldn't be putting on an extender.
Okay.
It needs to be a very high quality lens in order to put an extender, and then you need to have a very good extender for the optical formula to really work out right.
I mean, if you're experimenting with wildlife and sports and things like that, you're not doing it particularly seriously, but you want to get into it. I mean, I would say, you know, a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8, one of the Holy Trinity, with a good extender can get you quite a long way.
Okay.
But then the thing to bear in mind is with the 2 times extender on that, you are up to 400 millimeters, but your aperture drops from 2.8 to 5.6. That means your AF might not be able to keep up anymore.
Right.
There are all these payoffs. It's a very good way of getting longer reach and then seeing what you can do with it. But it's not a golden bullet.
Yeah, I think if you're into wildlife, you're looking at something that goes up to 300 or 400, and you're not as concerned about the aperture. Maybe a f5.6 aperture is going to be fine. But if you're doing sports, you really need to weigh off the length of the lens versus the speed of the lens, and that's where I would prefer to have a shorter lens that was faster.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Any other final points around this category of sports and any other recommendations?
One tip I would have actually is that never underestimate how little light there is for this kind of stuff. So always assume that you need a higher ISO than you think. Always assume that you should get as bright a lens as you possibly can. Yeah. You'd be amazed how little light there is, even in sports arenas.
So when you're considering looking at these cameras, what are those features then again that you want to look at how high the ISO can go, but how do you know when it's going to be a good quality at, some of them go to 32,000 or what have you.
That's when you would go check out dpreview.com's in-depth reviews, previews, and studio test scenes.
They have great tests there.
Exactly. Again, we've got a global audience here, and I would love to check in with Susan and see what we have going on online.
So the first question that's come up, if I were a mother and would love to active kids without missing a shot, I'd love to shoot active kids without missing a shot since they run around so much, what camera should I consider, or exactly what kind of factors on a compact camera?
Well, I tend to start with the safe choices, which would be something like one of the entry-level Canons or Nikons, SLRs. It's a traditional system. One of the things we haven't really mentioned before, but the new cameras with the electronic viewfinder, the mirrorless cameras, are a different style. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there is a reasonably high return rate on these cameras that are higher than the traditional SLR cameras. It's kind of like buying a convertible. Some people, in theory, they like it, but in the practical use of it, it just doesn't work out for them. And so if you're a little unsure about these, the safer choice is the standard SLRs. A Canon Rebel has always been a safe choice. I know there's a lot of people who just go, boring. And it's because it's a product that they've been working on for 25 years, and it's been refined a little bit better each time. It's a very safe choice to go with. The Nikon 5300 is a good competitor to that.
3200 and 5300.
And I always like to say, if you don't know what you're doing, just start with a zoom lens until you figure out exactly what you're doing, and then you'll figure out, oh, I really want that 50 millimeter prime lens so I can shoot those portraits.
I mean, if you're on a bit of a budget, looking for a compact, I mean, something like I would say right now, I would really recommend something like Sony RX100 II. It's not that much cheaper than a Rebel, but something like the Canon PowerShot G16, very responsive, surprisingly good AF now in these new generation PowerShots. Quite good image quality, high ISOs. That's going to do the job as well.
Yeah. The one I guess I would throw out a little nod out to is the Panasonic GH3 here. It's very small. It's got just enough controls on the outside that a photographer will be happy controlling it, but it's simple and very small and lightweight in size, and there's some very good lens options.
So if you do get an interchangeable lens camera, the first thing I would do is, the kit zoom's going to be fantastic most of the time. First thing to invest in would be a good fast prime lens, because that's great for portraits. It will give the AF system a really good chance, especially in poor light. It's going to be really, really good.
All right, Susan, one more.
All right. So this is a multiple kind of question. This is going to take a few. So get ready here. Okay. So the panel keeps talking about the importance of full frame cameras. And the question is it possible to get shallow depth of field as good as full frame on an APS-C, a crop sensor camera, also on micro 4/3 systems, and what lenses are needed with that? And there's more to this question.
Okay. Should we start with this part first?
Yes.
Well, the question is flawed from the very beginning. As good, well, there's always a lot of factors that play into it. Give me any camera on here and I can shoot shallow depth of field. Replace it with a full frame camera and I will get a shallower depth of field. And frankly, everyone out there just needs to calm down on this shallow depth of field thing. Gee, yes, it is a tool. That is a tool that I like to use. But let's just say, for instance, we have our studio audience here, and we don't have a lot of lights on them. Let's just say that I had to use an aperture of f2.8 to shoot a picture of them. With a smaller camera, 2.8 is going to give me more depth of field, and I'm going to get the back row in focus as well as the front row. And so there are just as many times for average photographers when they want that extra depth of field that they get with a small sensor, as opposed to wanting that shallow depth of field. Depth of field is a double-edged sword, and sometimes you want one, and sometimes you want the other.
Yeah. I mean, don't underestimate the benefit of having a wide depth of field, right? Because
Yes.
it hides focusing errors, apart from anything else.
Oh, yes.
If you try and shoot with a really shallow DOF with a full-frame camera, an f1.2 lens,
That's tough.
you've got to hope it's in focus, because
You're going for the eye.
Yeah.
And that you
But for the
easily
person
miss.
who does want the shallow depth of field, there's a number of factors. You want to have a bright lens, like an f2, f1.4 is great if you can get your hands on one. You want to get close to your subject. That's going to mean the background's going to go more out of focus. And one of the other tips is that okay, this is you, this is your subject, get the background very far away. So as I said before, don't line your subject up against the background. If I was going to do a portrait in our little studio here, I would try to find out what's the biggest working distance that I have. Where can I get the back wall the furthest away? Because then that's going to give that part of it shallower depth of field.
and zoom in and step back.
Yeah.
Because that's, if you can't afford an f1.4 and f1.2 lens, just, go to the long end of your kit zoom, get close, step back, and you'll find that the subject will pop away from the background. Technically, there is no way of getting the same depth of field as on a micro 4/3 or a 1-inch sensor as there is on full frame, all things being equal. The problem is all things are not equal.
Yes.
It's a hugely complicated question. But yeah, I think don't obsess too much about depth of field and shallow depth of field and subject
and
background
learn how to
separation.
use your tools like
Yes,
you're
exactly.
talking
Yeah,
about.
Yeah.
Well, the
You're
final
not wasting
part
any
of that,
film, so.
oh, sorry. The final part of that question was, wouldn't devices like the Metabone Speed Booster tighten the gap in that regards?
The what?
Yeah. Okay,
These
they're
two.
throwing it up a notch here.
I might bring you on, actually, Richard, because you've got a much, much better grasp of the technical aspects of this than me. What do you reckon? Sorry.
Do we have a mic?
Have a seat. Yeah.
The Metabone Speed Booster is essentially the opposite of a teleconverter. So it takes the light from a full frame lens and condenses it down onto a smaller sensor. So yes, you're absolutely right. That will give you, on an APS-C camera, the same control over depth of field that you would have got with that same lens mounted on a full frame camera. The downside is that most of the speed boosters require you to then focus manually. But yes, it is a way of mounting a full frame lens on an APS-C camera and getting that depth of field benefit.
The downsides might outweigh the benefits, I think, because even those that offer AF, it's not the world's
No.
best AF. It's very hesitant, quite slow.
So yeah, there are costs. It doesn't just give you full frame capability, but it's certainly a nice way around it. It's a very clever device.
So yes and no is the
Right. That's always
overall
a good
answer to
answer.
that overall question.